In the glittering halls of medieval France, a young queen painted her face with poison every single day. Isabella of Bavaria believed she was preserving her beauty, but with each application, she was slowly destroying her mind. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The mercury had already begun its irreversible work, transforming a promising young monarch into one of history's most infamous traitors. This is the story of vanity, madness, and the terrible price of beauty in the medieval world. The year was 1385, and 14-year-old Isabella of Bavaria was about to become Queen of France. She arrived at the French court as a political pawn married to King Charles V in an arrangement designed to strengthen alliances between the royal houses of Europe. Isabella was described by contemporary chroniclers as exceptionally beautiful, with fair hair, pale skin, and striking features that captivated the French nobility. She was ambitious, intelligent, and acutely aware that in the treacherous world of medieval politics, appearance mattered as much as bloodline. From her first days at court, Isabella understood that maintaining her beauty wasn't vanity, it was survival. Medieval European courts in the 14th and 15th centuries were obsessed with pale porcelain white skin. This wasn't merely a fashion preference, it was a powerful symbol of status, purity, and nobility. Tanned or ruddy skin indicated someone who worked outdoors, a peasant, a laborer, someone of low birth. The whiter your skin, the more clearly you signaled your elevated position in society. For queens and noble women, this standard was even more rigid. They were expected to embody an almost supernatural beauty, appearing as ethereal and untouchable as the Virgin Mary herself. Isabella, ambitious and determined to secure her position in the French court, embraced this beauty standard with fervent dedication. To achieve this coveted pal, noble women turned to a cosmetic known as Venetian ceruse, or spirits of Saturn. This white paste had been used since ancient Roman times and remained the most popular beauty product among European nobility throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. The formula was deceptively simple. White lead powder mixed with vinegar, sometimes enhanced with mercury compounds to increase its whitening power and give the skin an almost luminous quality. Women would apply thick layers of this paste to their faces, necks, and exposed skin, creating a mask of perfect ghostly whiteness. The effect was striking and dramatic, exactly the otherworldly appearance that court beauty demanded. But Venetian sus was a poison masquerading as beauty. Lead and mercury are both heavy metals that the human body cannot effectively process or eliminate. When absorbed through the skin, especially when applied daily over years or decades, these toxins accumulate in body tissues, particularly in the brain, liver, kidneys, and bones. Mercury is especially insidious because it crosses the blood-brain barrier easily, attacking the central nervous system directly. The symptoms of mercury poisoning developed slowly, making it difficult for victims to connect their deteriorating health with the cosmetics they'd been using for years. By the time the damage became obvious, it was already catastrophic and irreversible. Isabella applied Venetian Sioux religiously every single day. Contemporary accounts describe her elaborate beauty rituals, which could take hours to complete. Servants would first prepare her skin, washing it with various solutions. Then they would apply the thick white paste in careful layers, building up that perfect porcelain mask. The paste had to be thick enough to completely obscure any natural skin color or imperfections, but smooth enough to avoid looking cakey or artificial in candlelight. Once dried, the Sioux created a stiff, mask-like surface that cracked when the wearer smiled or frowned, which is why noble women cultivated those famously serene, expressionless faces. Every night, Isabella would scrub off the poisonous mask, damaging her skin further, only to reapply it the next morning. For the first several years of her reign, Isabella seemed to thrive. She bore Charles V multiple children, securing the succession and strengthening her position at court. She was known for her sophistication, her patronage of the arts, and her political acumen. She navigated the complex factions and rivalries of the French court with skill, building alliances, and accumulating power. Contemporary chroniclers praised her beauty and grace. But beneath the surface, the mercury was already at work. The poison was accumulating in her brain tissue, slowly altering the delicate chemistry that governed her thoughts, emotions, and behavior. The changes would be gradual at first, so subtle that no one, including Isabella herself, would recognize them as symptoms of poisoning. The French court of the late 14th century was a pressure cooker of political intrigue, where a queen's influence depended on her ability to produce heirs, maintain alliances, and navigate the endless machinations of rival noble houses. Isabella entered this world young and relatively inexperienced, but she learned quickly. However, her situation was about to become dramatically more complicated. In 1392, when Isabella was just 21 years old, her husband Charles V suffered the first of what would become recurring episodes of severe mental illness. The king experienced violent outbursts, paranoid delusions, and periods where he didn't recognize his own family. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding or treating such conditions, and the court was thrown into chaos as various factions vied for control during the king's incapacitation. Charles V's descent into madness transformed Isabella's role entirely. No longer simply a queen consort, she had to navigate a kingdom torn between competing regents, each claiming the right to rule in the king's name. The two main factions were led by Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's brother, and John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the king's cousin. These powerful nobles engaged in what was essentially a civil war for control of France, with Isabella caught in the middle. During this period, Isabella had to make crucial decisions about alliances, governance, and the education of her children. These were the years when she should have been at her most politically astute. Instead, these were precisely the years when mercury poisoning was beginning to erode her judgment. The first subtle signs of Isabella's mental deterioration appeared around 1405, roughly 20 years after she'd begun her daily applications of mercury-laden cosmetics. Those close to her began to notice changes in her behavior. She became more impulsive, making decisions that seemed out of character. Her moods swung unpredictably between euphoria and deep melancholy. She began to display what courtiers whispered about as inappropriate behavior, flirtations that went too far, comments that breached court etiquette, emotional reactions that seemed disproportionate to their causes. At first, these changes were attributed to the stress of her situation, a husband who was intermittently insane, a kingdom teetering on civil war, and the constant pressure of court politics. No one suspected the real culprit was the white pea. Asked, she applied to her face each morning. Mercury poisoning affects the brain in distinctive ways. It damages the cerebral cortex, the area responsible for higher reasoning, impulse control, and emotional regulation. It disrupts neurotransmitter function, altering mood, perception, and behavior. Victims often experience what's called erethism mercurialis, a constellation of symptoms including irritability, anxiety, mood swings, and social withdrawal. More severe poisoning produces tremors, memory loss, paranoia, and hallucinations. The progression is insidious because the symptoms can mimic other conditions, stress, depression, or natural personality changes. For someone in Isabella's position, under enormous pressure, surrounded by genuine threats and conspiracies, the paranoid thoughts induced by mercury poisoning would have been indistinguishable from reasonable weariness. By 1407, Isabella's behavior had become markedly more erratic. Contemporary chroniclers began documenting incidents that shocked the court. She openly took lovers, showing little concern for the scandal this created. Her most notable affair was with Louis, Duke of Orleans, her husband's own brother. This relationship wasn't just a personal matter, it had massive political implications. When Louis was assassinated in 1407 on the orders of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, suspicions flew. Some whispered that Isabella had been complicit, that she'd betrayed her lover to secure an alliance with Burgund. Others suggested she'd been manipulated, her judgment too impaired to see the trap closing around her. The truth was, probably more tragic. Isabella's mercury-damaged brain could no longer properly assess risk, loyalty, or consequence. What made Isabella's case particularly devastating was how the physical symptoms of mercury poisoning reinforced and accelerated the psychological ones. The cosmetic that was supposed to preserve her beauty was destroying it. Mercury poisoning causes a distinctive set of physical symptoms: hair loss, tooth decay, skin discoloration, and a grayish pallor. The irony was cruel. Isabella used Suze to maintain her pale, beautiful complexion, but the mercury was turning her skin an unhealthy gray. Her hair, once lustrous and fair, began falling out in clumps. Her teeth, subjected to years of mercury exposure, rotted and turned black. She developed a tremor in her hands. The more her appearance deteriorated, the more desperately she applied the Suze, trying to cover the damage. But she was trying to hide the symptoms of the very poison she kept applying. The relationship between Isabella's deteriorating appearance and her erratic behavior created a feedback loop that accelerated her decline. In a court where beauty equaled power, Isabella's fading looks undermined her political position. As her influence waned, her paranoia increased. As her paranoia increased, she made worse decisions which further isolated her. Mercury poisoning also causes something called intentional tremor, shaking that worsens when trying to perform precise movements. For a queen whose daily routine involved elaborate rituals of dressing, eating in public, and performing ceremonial duties, these tremors would have been humiliating. Contemporary accounts mention Isabella increasingly withdrawing from public view, conducting business through intermediaries, avoiding the formal ceremonies where her condition would be most visible. Perhaps most heartbreaking was Isabella's relationship with her children. She had borne Charles V's 612 children, though several died in infancy, a common tragedy in medieval times. The surviving children should have been her greatest source of security and influence. A medieval queen's power often derived from her role as mother to the heirs, the link between the current reign and the next. But Isabella displayed increasingly little maternal affection or interest in her children. She abandoned them to the care of others, showed no emotion at their illnesses or deaths, and made political decisions that directly harmed their interests. This wasn't normal maternal behavior, even by the standards of medieval nobility, where children were often seen primarily as political assets. Contemporary chroniclers expressed shock at her coldness toward her own offspring. This maternal indifference wasn't character, it was neurotoxicity. Mercury poisoning affects the limbic system, the part of the brain that governs emotional responses, attachment, and empathy. As the mercury accumulated in Isabella's brain tissue, it literally damaged her capacity to feel normal maternal love. She could intellectually understand that these were her children, but the emotional connection had been severed by chemical damage. This made her vulnerable to manipulation by political actors who could appeal to her self-interest while bypassing any maternal instinct that might have protected her children. She began to view her own offspring not as beloved children, but as pawns or even obstacles in a political game she was increasingly unable to play coherently. The political situation in France was deteriorating rapidly. The civil war between the Armagnac faction, supporters of the murdered Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundian faction, supporters of John the Fearless, was tearing the kingdom apart. Meanwhile, England saw opportunity in France's weakness. King Henry V of England invaded France in 1415, winning the catastrophic Battle of Argenout and occupying large portions of northern France. France needed unity, strong leadership, and strategic clarity. Instead, it had a mad king who believed he was made of glass, a poisoned queen whose judgment was fatally compromised, and noble factions more interested in destroying each other than defending the realm. Into this chaos stepped the architects of what would become Isabella's greatest act of betrayal. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, had been cultivating an alliance with Isabella for years. After his assassination in 1419, his son Philip the Good continued the policy but with a new twist: alliance with England. They convinced Isabella that her best path to security lay in cooperation with King Henry V of England. To a healthy mind, this proposal would have been obviously treasonous. But to Isabella's mercury-damaged brain, riddled with paranoia and unable to properly assess long-term consequences, it seemed like a solution. She was told her son Charles the Dauphin, heir to the French throne, was plotting against her. She was told the English alliance would bring peace. She was told she could secure her own position and safety. Each of these arguments played on the specific vulnerabilities created by mercury poisoning: paranoia, impaired judgment, and inability to think beyond immediate self-interest. In May 1420, Isabella committed the act that would define her historical legacy. She signed the Treaty of Troyes, one of the most catastrophic agreements in French history. The treaty essentially surrendered France to England. It declared that King Henry V of England would marry Isabella's daughter, Catherine, and become heir to the French throne upon Charles V's death. Most shockingly, it disinherited Isabella's own son, Charles the Dauphin, declaring him illegitimate and unfit to rule. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was a mother disowning her child and giving his birthright to a foreign enemy. The treaty meant that if it were enforced, the Kingdom of France would cease to exist as an independent entity, absorbed into a combined English-French realm under English rule. The Treaty of Troyes stands as one of the most controversial documents in French history, and Isabella's role in it has been debated for 6 centuries. How could a Queen of France sign away her kingdom? How could a mother disinherit her son in favor of a foreign king? Traditional historians attributed these actions to political calculation, corruption, or moral weakness. They called Isabella a traitor, a villain, or simply an evil woman. But modern analysis of her symptoms, combined with what we now know about mercury poisoning, suggests a more tragic explanation. Isabella wasn't evil, she was brain damaged. The mercury that had accumulated in her neural tissue over 35 years had destroyed her capacity for sound judgment. She likely couldn't distinguish between genuine threats and paranoid delusions. She couldn't anticipate consequences. She couldn't feel the maternal instinct that might have protected her son. The Treaty of Troyes didn't bring Isabella the security she'd been promised. Instead, it made her one of the most hated figures in France. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited and enraged, refused to accept the treaty. He maintained his claim to the throne and continued fighting from his base in central France. Much of the French population, despite the English military presence, considered the treaty illegitimate and treasonous. Isabella found hers, isolated even among her former allies. The Burgundians had gotten what they wanted from her, and now had little use for a discredited queen. The English treated her with formal courtesy, but little real respect. Her own children, except for those who'd been married off to seal the treaty, wanted nothing to do with her. King Charles V died in 1422, and according to the Treaty of Troyes, King Henry V of England should have become King of France. But Henry V had died just 2 months earlier, throwing the entire arrangement into chaos. His infant son was proclaimed King of England and France, but France was far from accepting this. The Dauphin Charles had himself crowned King Charles VII, that reigns in 1429, aided by a peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who claimed divine guidance. The treaty Isabella had signed led not to peace, but to decades more of war. The H-100 Red Years' War would drag on for another 30 years, devastating France. Countless thousands died in battles, sieges, and famines that followed from the political chaos Isabella's treaty had helped create. Isabella lived to see the beginning of France's recovery under her disinherited son, Charles II, though she played no part in it. She spent her final years in relative isolation, her health continuing to deteriorate. The mercury poisoning that had destroyed her mind was now ravaging her body systematically. Her kidneys were failing, unable to filter the accumulated heavy metals. Her liver was damaged beyond repair. Her bone had become brittle and weak as mercury displaced calcium in her skeletal system. Her hands shook constantly. Her teeth were gone. Her once beautiful face was grey, gaunt, and aged far beyond her years. She was only in her 62nd, but she looked ancient. The soothes that were supposed to preserve her beauty had made her hideously ugly. The neurological damage was equally severe. By the end of her life, Isabella's cognitive function had deteriorated dramatically. She experienced severe memory loss, often failing to recognize people she'd known for decades. She had difficulty speaking coherently, her words slurred by the tremors affecting her facial muscles and tongue. She experienced hallucinations and delusions, though whether these were from the mercury poisoning, other illnesses, or simply the trauma of her situation is impossible to determine. Contemporary accounts describe her as being in a state of near constant confusion. She would sometimes ask for children who had died years earlier. She would refer to herself as if she was still a young queen. She seemed unable to understand or process what had happened to her life, her kingdom, or her legacy. Isabella died on September 29, 1435, in Paris. She was 64 years old. Her death was barely noted by the court. No great ceremonies marked her passing. Her son, Charles II, whom she had disinherited, didn't attend any memorial services. The chronicles of the time mentioned her death as a minor footnote. The woman who had once been Queen of France, who had lived in unimaginable luxury, who had held enormous political power, died isolated and despised. She was buried quietly at Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French monarchs, but her tomb was not grand. In the centuries since, while other medieval queens have been remembered with sympathy or admiration, Isabella has remained one of history's villains, the queen who betrayed France. But viewing Isabella purely as a villain ignores the medical tragedy underlying her story. She didn't choose to destroy her judgment. She was poisoned by a beauty product that everyone in her society considered safe and desirable. She didn't decide to become paranoid and erratic. Mercury systematically damaged the parts of her brain that controlled those functions. She didn't wake up one day and decide to betray her country and her children. She made those decisions with a brain that could no longer properly assess reality. This doesn't excuse the consequences of her actions. The Treaty of Troy was a disaster for France, prolonging war and suffering for decades. But it reframes our understanding of responsibility and agency. Isabella was both perpetrator and victim. The story of Isabella of Bavaria illuminates a broader truth about medieval beauty standards and their deadly consequences. Venetian ceruse wasn't just used by queens, it was used by noble women throughout Europe for centuries. Thousands upon thousands of women applied lead and mercury to their faces daily, slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of an arbitrary beauty standard. The cosmetic industry of the time knew the dangers. Physicians warned about the health effects of ceruse, but the social pressure to maintain pale skin was so intense that women continued using it anyway. Some applied it even more heavily to cover the grey pallor that was actually a symptom of poisoning. They literally poisoned themselves to hide the evidence of poisoning. The irony of Isabella's story is profound and multifaceted. She used ceruse to preserve her beauty, but it destroyed her appearance. She sought to maintain her status and power through beautiful appearance, but the poison undermined her political judgment. She worried about her position and security so much that she made decisions influenced by mercury-induced paranoia that destroyed any real security she might have had. She wanted to be remembered as a beautiful and powerful queen, but history remembers her as a traitor. Every goal she pursued, the ceruse helped to undermine. The very tool she used to achieve her ambitions became the instrument of her destruction. Isabella's husband, King Charles V, deserves mention as well in this tragedy. His own madness, which manifested earlier and more dramatically than Isabella's, may also have had roots in mercury exposure. Charles famously believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. He had violent episodes where he attacked his own courtiers and family members. He experienced long periods where he didn't recognize anyone, including his wife and children. While some of his symptoms suggest schizophrenia or another primary psychiatric disorder, others, particularly the tremors, the periods of lucidity between episodes, and the age of onset, are consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Medieval nobles used mercury-based treatments for various ailments, and Charles may have been exposed through medicines as well as through environmental contamination in the palace. The French court during Charles V-6's reign was likely saturated with mercury in ways modern people would find shocking. Beyond the cosmetics, mercury was used in gilding metals for decoration, in various medical treatments, in inks and dyes, and in other palace crafts. The wealthy lived in an environment of chronic heavy metal exposure. This context suggests that Isabella's poisoning, while severe, may not have been unique. How many other historical figures made seemingly inexplicable decisions while suffering from undiagnosed mercury poisoning? How many political disasters, family tragedies, and historical turning points were influenced by the slow rot of poisoned brains? We'll never know. But Isabella's case suggests we should view some historical actors with more medical sophistication and less moral judgment. The medical understanding of mercury poisoning has evolved dramatically since Isabella's time. In the medieval period, there was no concept of chemical toxicity as we understand it. Physicians recognized that certain substances were harmful if ingested in large amounts, but they had no framework for understanding chronic low-level exposure or accumulation in body tissues. Mercury was actually considered therapeutic in some contexts. It was used to treat syphilis and other conditions, often causing more harm than the original disease. The connection between cosmetic use of mercury and neurological symptoms wasn't definitively established until centuries after Isabella's death by the 18th century. Physicians were beginning to make the connection, but ceruse remained popular. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that the use of mercury in cosmetics was finally banned in most countries. Modern cases of mercury poisoning still occur, though rarely from cosmetics in regulated markets. However, some traditional and unregulated beauty products from various cultures still contain mercury compounds, causing sporadic poisoning cases. Industrial exposure remains a risk for certain workers. Environmental mercury contamination from coal-fired power plants and other sources leads to mercury accumulation in fish, creating ongoing health concerns. The symptoms of mercury poisoning remain the same: tremors, cognitive impairment, mood changes, kidney damage, and neurological deterioration. Modern medicine can diagnose mercury poisoning through blood and urine tests and can sometimes reduce the body burden of mercury through chelation therapy. But damage already done to the brain and organs is often permanent. Isabella had no such options. Once the mercury was in her system, destroying her neurons, there was no way to stop or reverse the process. The psychological dimension of Isabella's story adds another layer of tragedy. Even if she had somehow learned that the Suze was poisoning her, could she have stopped using it? The social pressure to maintain the appearance of a queen was immense. Her political power depended partly on embodying the ideal of royal beauty. Appearing in court without the white face paint would have been seen as scandalous, improper, and indicative of her declining status. She would have faced gossip, loss of influence, and social ostracism. Moreover, by the time serious symptoms appeared, Isabella's judgment was already compromised. The mercury-damaged brain couldn't rationally assess the mercury risk. This is a pattern seen in many poisoning cases. By the time the victim realizes something is wrong, their mental capacity to address the problem is already impaired. We must also consider the role of the people around Isabella. Did no one at the French court recognize what was happening? Surely someone noticed the correlation between the cosmetic use and the physical symptoms. The answer is that some probably did suspect, but they had neither the power nor the incentive to intervene. Physicians of the era, even if they suspected the Suze, couldn't prove causation and couldn't have convinced Isabella to stop using a product. That was essential to her social role. Political rivals may have preferred to see Isabella compromised and making poor decisions. Allies and family members may have attributed the symptoms to stress or moral weakness rather than medical causes. And as Isabella became more paranoid and erratic, she may have rejected or punished anyone who questioned her beauty regimen. The servants who applied Isabella's serums daily were likely also affected, though their stories are lost to history. They handled the toxic paste with their bare hands. They breathed the fine powder as they mixed it. They probably applied it to their own faces as well, mimicking their mistress and following the beauty standards of the time. These anonymous women, ladies-in-waiting, chambermaids and cosmetic specialists, were exposed to the same poison as Isabella, possibly in even higher concentrations due to their more direct contact with the raw materials. How many of them experienced tremors, confusion, and premature death? How many of their children were born with birth defects caused by maternal mercury exposure? The historical record doesn't tell us. They were considered too insignificant to document, but their suffering was likely just as real as Isabella's. Isabella's children bore the consequences of her mercury poisoning in multiple ways. First, she was emotionally unavailable to them due to the neurological damage affecting her capacity for attachment. Second, her poor political judgment put them in danger and ultimately disinherited at least one of them. Third, they likely suffered mercury exposure themselves. Mercury crosses the placental barrier, meaning Isabella's children were exposed in utero. They may also have been exposed through breast milk if Isabella nursed them, though royal children were typically given to wet nurses. Additionally, as they grew up in the court, they would have been exposed to the same environmental mercury sources as their parents. Some of Isabella's children died young, which was common in medieval times, but could have been exacerbated by mercury exposure. Others lived to adulthood, but faced the consequences of the political chaos their mother helped create. The daughter who suffered most directly from Isabella's actions was Catherine of Valois, who was married to King Henry V of England as part of the Treaty of Troyes. Catherine was essentially sold by her mother to seal a treasonous agreement. She became Queen of England, bore Henry V's son, who would briefly rule as King of France according to the treaty, and after Henry's death married a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor. She died young, possibly from mental illness. Her son, by Henry V, suffered bouts of severe mental instability that may have had genetic roots, though environmental mercury exposure could have been a contributing factor across generations. Catherine's life was shaped entirely by her mother's treaty, and she never returned to France. She died in exile, a political pawn in a game her mercury-poisoned mother could no longer properly play. The son Isabella disinherited. Charles became King Charles II, and eventually drove the English out of France. But the path to that victory cost countless lives and took decades. Charles never forgave his mother. He refused to see her in her final years. He never publicly acknowledged the possibility that her actions were influenced by illness rather than malice. From his perspective, she had betrayed him, betrayed France, and prolonged a war that devastated the kingdom. Even after becoming secure on his throne, Charles rarely mentioned his mother. When forced to discuss her, he referred to her coldly, if not with outright contempt. The psychological damage of being publicly declared illegitimate and disinherited by one's own mother, whether she was in her right mind or not, shaped Charles for the rest of his life. The historical treatment of Isabella of Bavaria has varied over the centuries, but she has rarely been viewed sympathetically. French historians particularly have portrayed her as a villain, a collaborator, a traitor, a woman who put her own interests above her country and her children. She appears in historical dramas and novels as a scheming antagonist. She's been compared to other notorious queens like Marie Antoinette, though Isabella's reputation is arguably worse. Even more sympathetic modern historians, while acknowledging the pressures she faced and the chaos of her era, struggled to explain in a way the Treaty of Troyes. It remains one of the most indefensible acts in French royal history. The knowledge that she was probably suffering from mercury poisoning doesn't excuse the treaty's consequences, but it does complicate our moral judgment of Isabella as a person. Medical historians who have examined Isabella's case in retrospect see a textbook example of chronic mercury poisoning. The timeline fits perfectly. Decades of exposure beginning in adolescence, gradual onset of symptoms in middle age, progressive deterioration and death in her 60 seconds, with evidence of severe neurological and physical damage. The specific symptoms reported: behavioral changes, paranoia, poor judgment, maternal indifference, tremors, hair loss, dental problems, skin discoloration, all align with known effects of mercury toxicity. If Isabella were a patient presenting today with her history and symptoms, mercury poisoning would be diagnosed quickly and definitively, but in her own time she was simply considered mad, wicked, or weak. The true cause of her destruction remained invisible. The broader lesson of Isabella's story extends beyond one poisoned queen. It's about how society's beauty standards can become literally toxic, how vanity can have consequences far beyond the personal, and how environmental and consumer health risks can remain invisible until tragedy strikes. Isabella lived in a time when mercury cosmetics were ubiquitous and unquestioned. She followed the beauty practices of our culture without knowing they were poisoning her. Modern people might feel superior, imagining we would never be so foolish. But every era has its invisible health risks. How many current beauty products, food additives, environmental exposures, or lifestyle practices will future generations look back on with horror? How many of us are being slowly poisoned by substances we consider safe? Isabella's story is also about the vulnerability of the human brain and how easily it can be damaged. The brain is protected by the skull, but it's also isolated, dependent on chemicals delivered through the bloodstream. When those chemicals are corrupted by toxins like mercury, the effects ripple through every aspect of personality, judgment, and behavior. Isabella didn't choose to become paranoid, impulsive, or cold toward her children. The mercury chose for her, altering her neural chemistry until she was no longer the person she had been. This raises profound questions about identity, free will, and responsibility. At what point did Isabella stop being Isabella and become a mercury-poisoned shell, making decisions that the real Isabella would have rejected? We can't pinpoint that moment, which makes the tragedy even more unsettling. The economic dimension of this tragedy shouldn't be overlooked either. Venetian Suze was expensive. It was a luxury product that only the wealthy could afford in the quantities needed for daily use. Poorer women who aspired to noble beauty standards might do with cheaper, safer alternatives, or simply go without. In a darkly ironic way, the poor were protected from this particular poison by their poverty. Meanwhile, the rich, the queens, duchesses, and noble women who could afford unlimited sous poisoned themselves most thoroughly. Wealth bought beauty, which brought status, which demanded more beauty products, which brought poisoning. The rich were killing themselves with their own luxury goods, victims of their own excess and the invisible dangers of the consumer products available in their time. The suppliers and manufacturers of Venetian ceruse bear their own responsibility in this story. By the medieval period, some physicians and scholars had written about the dangers of lead and mercury, noting correlations between cosmetic use and health problems. This knowledge wasn't hidden in obscure texts. It was discussed in medical literature available to educated people. Yet, the Suze manufacturers continued producing and selling their product without warning. They profited from beauty-obsessed noblewomen like Isabella taking their money while knowing or suspecting that the product caused harm. This is a pattern that has repeated throughout history, industries prioritizing profit over safety, claiming ignorance of risks while evidence mounts, fighting regulation and warning labels to protect their market. The merchants who sold Isabella her Suze were complicit in her destruction. The physical appearance of Suze itself was a warning that went unheeded. The white paste looked unnatural because it was unnatural, a chemical mask rather than skin. It felt stiff and uncomfortable. It flaked and cracked. Removing it required harsh scrubbing that damaged the skin, which then required more Suze to cover the damage. Any objective observer could see this was not a healthy practice. But fashion and beauty standards override common sense then and now. Women accepted the discomfort as the price of beauty. They believed the propaganda that pale skin signified purity and nobility. They trusted that if queens used ceruse, it must be safe. Isabella, like thousands of others, paid for that trust with her mind and her life. Isabella's isolation in her final years parallels the isolation of many victims of chronic illness and dementia. As her symptoms worsened, people withdrew from her. Some were disgusted by her appearance. Others were uncomfortable with her erratic behavior. Former friends and allies abandoned her once she'd served their political purposes. Her children wanted nothing to do with her. Even servants may have requested reassignment away from the difficult, confused old woman who had once been queen. This social abandonment is common for people suffering from neurological decline, and it compounds the tragedy. Isabella was dying not only from mercury poisoning but from loneliness. The woman who had lived at the center of the most glittering court in Europe died isolated and ignored, her mind too damaged to even fully understand what she'd lost. What makes Isabella's story particularly haunting is that she almost certainly never understood what had happened to her. She died not knowing that the beauty product she'd used faithfully for 50 years had destroyed her brain. She probably believed her own paranoia was justified. Her political decisions were sound, and her mental confusion was just old age. She may have died thinking she'd done her best in impossible circumstances, or perhaps in moments of lucidity, she recognized that something was terribly wrong with her mind, but couldn't identify the cause. Imagine the terror of realizing you can't trust your own thoughts, but not knowing why. Imagine looking in a mirror and seeing a gray-faced stranger with trembling hands and black teeth. Remembering you were once considered beautiful but unable to connect that the beauty treatment caused the ugliness. That incomprehension, that inability to understand her own tragedy, may be the most tragic element of all. The mercury that destroyed Isabella's brain had a half-life measured in decades. Even if she'd stopped using Ciroux's midlife, the mercury already absorbed would have continued damaging her for years. The poison was persistent, accumulating in her tissues faster than her body could eliminate it. Every day of application added to the total body burden. Every month, every year, the concentration increased. By the time symptoms appeared, she'd already been effectively brain damaged for years. This is characteristic of heavy metal poisoning. The damage is cumulative and largely irreversible. Modern chelation therapy can remove mercury from the bloodstream and soft tissues, but it cannot repair neurons that have already been destroyed. If Isabella had access to 21st century medicine, doctors could have diagnosed her poisoning, stopped further exposure, and removed some of the remaining mercury, but they couldn't have restored her damaged brain or given her back the years of sound judgment she'd lost. Isabella's case has been studied by medical historians as one of the clearest examples of cosmetic poisoning in the historical record. Unlike many cases where symptoms are ambiguous or poorly documented, Isabella's story is relatively well recorded. Contemporary chronicles documented her behavioral changes, physical symptoms, and political decisions. They described her appearance, her actions, and the reactions of those around her. They didn't understand the cause, but they preserved the evidence. Modern doctors and toxicologists can review these accounts and confidently diagnose mercury poisoning retrospectively. This makes Isabella's case valuable for understanding how poisoning manifested in medieval populations and how it might have influenced historical events in ways previously unrecognized. In the centuries since Isabella's death, mercury cosmetics eventually fell out of favor as knowledge of toxicity improved and as beauty standards shifted. But the story didn't end there. New dangerous beauty products replaced the old ones. Lid-based hair dyes, arsenic complexion wafers, radioactive face creams, and other toxic cosmetics remain popular into the 20th century. Each generation had to relearn that beauty should not cost health or life. Even today, unregulated cosmetics in some markets contain heavy metals, and new chemical concerns emerge regularly. The underlying dynamic hasn't changed. Society establishes beauty standards. Industries profit by selling products to meet those standards, and individual health is sacrificed in pursuit of an arbitrary ideal. Isabella's story is a historical example of a perpetual problem. The Treaty of Troy, Isabella's most infamous act, was eventually nullified. Charles V, with the help of Joan of Arc and shifting political circumstances, managed to unite enough of France to push back the English occupation. By 1453, nearly 20 years after Isabella's death, the H-100 Red Years' War finally ended with English forces expelled from all of France except Calala. The vision of a unified English-French kingdom under English rule, which the Treaty of Troy had briefly established, dissolved entirely. France survived as an independent kingdom, but the cost had been staggering. Decades of additional warfare, territories devastated, countless dead, and a kingdom weakened for generations. And at the root of this catastrophe, at least in part, was a mercury-poisoned queen who signed away her country because her damaged brain couldn't properly assess the consequences. If there's any consolation in Isabella's story, it's that she didn't live to see the full consequences of the Treaty of Troyes. She died in 1435, still believing perhaps that the treaty would bring peace and stability. She didn't witness Charles II's recovery of France. She didn't see the final English defeat. She didn't know that history would remember the treaty as a humiliating failure and her as a traitor. She died in confusion and isolation. But at least she was spared the knowledge of her complete historical vilification, sometimes ignorance. Even ignorance imposed by brain damage is a mercy. Isabella lived and died in a fog of mercury-induced delusion, and perhaps that fog was the only kindness left to her in the end. The story of Isabella of Bavaria is ultimately about the invisible dangers that surround us and the terrible price of vanity. A young woman came to the French court with beauty, intelligence, and ambition. She followed the beauty practices of her era faithfully, believing she was doing what was necessary to maintain her position and power. She didn't know she was slowly poisoning herself. By the time symptoms appeared, the damage was irreversible. The mercury destroyed her judgment, her relationships, her political legacy, and finally her life. She became one of history's villains, not through evil intent, but through tragic circumstance and toxic exposure. She sacrificed everything, her beauty, her health, her family, her country, and her reputation on the altar of a poisonous beauty standard. In the end, Isabella of Bavaria serves as a warning across the centuries. Beauty standards can kill, cosmetics can poison, and vanity can have consequences far beyond the personal. The white face paint that made her look like a queen destroyed everything she had. The ceruse promised eternal beauty and delivered eternal infamy. The poison that gave her porcelain skin took her mind, her health, and her legacy. 6 centuries after her death, we can finally diagnose what killed her, but we cannot undo the damage. Isabella's tragedy is complete, permanent, and utterly preventable. She was beautiful once, and ambitious, and doomed from the moment she first applied that white paste to her young face. The mercury got into her brain, and nothing would ever be the same.